Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Pakistan's economy has been faced with many difficulties recently, and especially the situation got a little more difficult after the recent devastating floods. But the government has been trying its utmost to stabilize the country's economy. Now, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif in this regard has instructed the Finance Ministry and the Power Division to prepare a plan and to unlock that IMF program, the 9th review of which is pending, and there are certain conditions by the IMF which include a mini budget for the additional taxation measures, as well as hike in gas and electricity tariff. At the same time, we see there were certain segments of the media in which a report was circulating that the World Bank had delayed the approval of 2 loans worth 1.1 billion until the next fiscal year. This news has been rebutted by the World Bank country director, and he said that it is unfounded. However, the World Bank believes that for Pakistan to achieve the macroeconomic stability, the power sector needs to be fixed. Now, when we talk about the vision of Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, he has a clear vision that the masses shouldn't be burdened, and that's why whatever the tough measures have to be taken in order to stabilize the country's economy should be staggered over time. At the same time, the authorities in Pakistan also believe that in the aftermath of the devastating floods Pakistan had to face during the summer of 2022, the IMF and the World Bank should show some sort of flexibility. At the same time, there is a major development. The 8th meeting of the Pakistani-Russian Intergovernmental Commission on Trade, Economic, Scientific and Technical Cooperation has started, and the Russian Energy Minister, Mr. Nikolai Shuklinov, has said that our goal is to develop a cooperative business relations with Pakistan, as well as we have discussed cooperation in energy, industry, agriculture, customs, education, IT and other various sectors. We'll be looking into this particular thing, and we'll be talking about the conditions set by IMF to unlock that program with Pakistan, as well as what sort of understanding the World Bank has regarding the power sector, the circular debt problem the country is faced with. And to talk more about this, we are honored to have been joined on the Skype by Dr. Aqdas Afzal. He is senior economist. Dr. Afzal, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. At the same time, on the phone line, we are being joined by Dr. Niaz Murtaza. He is political economist. Dr. Murtaza, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Now, Dr. Aqdas Afzal, let me begin the discussion with you. Now, when we talk about the conditions which have been set by the IMF, the first and the foremost is to have a mini budget around 170 billion to 200 billion rupees for the additional taxation measures. And now, how crucial is this particular thing in order to broaden the tax net here in Pakistan?
Thank you very much for taking me on your show. I think the first thing that I would like to say is that in the present situation where Pakistani economy is facing many challenges, I think this needs to be extremely and crystal clear to our policymakers that Pakistan must be able to convince the IMF to bring back the plan, the deal that we have with them back online, because I think this is going to serve as the lifeline that is required for Pakistan's economy. Now, the IMF has made certain demands, or they attach certain conditions which are normally called conditionalities. And one of them has to do with raising Pakistan's public revenue, or narrowing the gaps that we have in our public finance system. And I think as a part of those efforts, it is very important that the government has a very clear and tangible plan to increase its revenues, because without that, it would be very difficult to convince the IMF to bring this plan back online.
Right. Dr. Afzal, what measures do you suggest should be taken by the authorities in order to broaden this particular tax net?
Well, in my personal opinion, I think there is a case to tax the well-off or the rich people in this country, because as of right now, uh, everybody pays taxes in Pakistan. So this idea that a lot of people don't pay taxes is not simply correct, because when you go to the gas station to get petrol, or you upload or load up the balance in your mobile phone, everybody is paying taxes. So I think that there should be a plan by this government to find ways in which the well-off or the rich sectors and people in this segments of society can be taxed, because otherwise it would be very, very difficult to squeeze more taxes out of people who are already suffering under the burden of very high inflation, which ended up at 25% at the end of last month.
Right. Dr. Matsuda, how crucial is it to take the additional taxation measures in order to unlock the IMF program?
Well, it's very clear from the news that we are getting over the last few weeks about the negotiations that have been, the prolonged negotiations that have been happening between Pakistan and IMF, that the IMF is extremely stubborn about this increase in tax. I mean, you can question the wisdom of doing that in a period when the economy is already stagnant. Growth is very low. People are already overburdened. Increasing taxes slows down, economic activity even further. But then, this is the nature of IMF programs. And, at the end of the day, once you've tried hard enough to negotiate with them, you need the money so badly. You need, the stamp of approval even more badly, because a lot of other donors don't unlock their funds until there is the stamp of approval of IMF. So when you are so deep into an economic crisis, unfortunately, there is no other way to crawl out of it other than, the rope that the IMF throws. And it has a lot of, tough conditionalities, which may, increase the fiscal deficit and, even inflation in some ways. But at the end of the day, you have to, take the bitter pill, because we don't have any other choices. So I think it's critical without getting the IMF deal signed, and I think it should have been signed a couple of months back, and by now, the money should have been unlocked. And that's why we are facing such a foreign exchange crunch, because the IMF money and the other money tied to it has not been coming through. So the better we solve this issue, the better it is for Pakistan.
Right. Dr. Afzal, there is an FBR assessment, an internal assessment that has been carried out. The target for the tax during this fiscal year was around 7,470 billion rupees. There's been a shortfall that has been recorded, 225 billion rupees. And it also estimates that in future, in the entire fiscal year, it would be around 170 billion rupees. So there is a deficit of around 300 to 400 billion rupees. So what sort of measures in order to broaden it and overcome this particular deficit of 170 billion during the current fiscal year in the immediate term should be done?
I have actually written about this. In a column that I wrote for a newspaper a couple of months ago, I had predicted that there were going to be certain fiscal shortfalls. And at the time, I had actually made the case that there are grounds for the government to institute a new tax. And they can call it a flood relief tax. That has been done previously in Pakistan. That's done in other countries around the world. But I think that measure has run into some legal problems in the courts. So I think the intention was correct, and I think this is the kind of out-of-the-box thinking that is required
Dr.
right
Afzal,
now.
when you talk about this flood relief tax, is it synonymous to the flood levy? According to some media reports, the government authorities are considering which might fetch 100 billion rupees,
Yes.
and to control imports as well. Is it synonymous to that one?
Well, I think the government is thinking about putting a flood levy on imports. And I think the World Bank in particular is not very happy about putting an additional levy on Pakistan's imports, because then, that creates distortions as far as the economy is concerned. At least that's what the World Bank's position is. What
And
I was
what that
proposing.
distortion causes as an outcome?
Well, I mean, when we talk about distortions in economics, what that really means is that it takes you away from, uh, reaching equilibrium outcomes. I mean, it's a theoretical idea. So, I mean, what it really means is that you could actually end up with a, a better position in the economy if the distortions were not there. But I mean, my idea, or what I had suggested to the government, was not just a levy on imports. Rather, it was, putting an extra flood relief tax on all non-essential expenditures that people seem to be doing. For example, I mean, one way in which this could be done is to put a flood relief tax on cinema houses, or putting a flood relief tax on restaurants, or expensive restaurants, or on the purchase of certain very expensive vehicles in Pakistan, or when you sell and purchase certain plots of land. So I think there are a number of ways in which this can be
Now,
done
the
in
two
Pakistan.
areas, Dr. Afzal, the two areas that you have mentioned, for example, it is if it is implemented on cinemas and expensive restaurants. So don't you think that is going to trickle down onto the consumer at the end of the day?
Yes, it is going to trickle down on consumers who can afford going to cinema houses that charge upwards of 1,000 to 1,500 rupees per movie. And I think no poor people in this country are going to cinemas watching movies that cost 1,500 rupees per person. So I think there's a certain segment that has that kind of a disposable income. And I'm not talking about, putting an extra tax of 100 or 200 rupees. I mean, we are talking about a few percentage points. And I think these are some of the out-of-the-box thinking that is going to be required if Pakistan is going to be able to bridge the fiscal gap that it needs to bridge in order to convince the IMF that they should now bring
Right.
the program back online.
Right. Let me bring in Dr. Murtaza also into the discussion. Dr. Murtaza, what needs to be done, do you think, in the immediate term by the authorities in order to implement those additional tax measures and reach that target and overcome that deficit, which by the internal assessment of FBR is around 170 billion rupees?
Well, the important thing is to, protect the poor. They should, be very careful in, what kind of heads they cover. And as Dr. Afzal was saying, they should focus on, the ultra-rich and their consumption. If you, jack up sales taxes or taxes on food, that affects the poor very badly. It increases inflation, it cuts their income. So it has to be very targeted taxes which only, affect the rich people who can afford to pay and who actually are underpaying on their taxes in so many different ways. Then the government can, reduce the subsidies that it gives to a lot of elites. You might have seen this UNDP report about, billions and billions of dollars of subsidies being given to rich elites. So it's those kind of things that, the government should focus on increasing so that, it meets its targets without putting a burden on the poor. And that's just one thing. I think the other thing that IMF is talking about is, rationalizing the foreign exchange rate, because there's a lot of rationing going on right now because the funds have gone down so much that a lot of LCs are not being, met and so on. So there's a host of measures besides the taxation measures as well, which the government will have to look into very quickly so that we can get, the IMF deal on board soon enough.
Right. We're joined by another participant in the show, Dr. Vaqar Ahmed. He's Joint Executive Director, Sustainable Development Policy Institute. Dr. Vaqar, thank you very much for joining in at Views on News tonight. So we're talking about the major IMF conditions as the 9th review with the IMF is still pending. And it happens to be a lifeline for Pakistan as it is faced with many economic difficulties. Now, the first condition we are already discussing with our panelists is to bring in the additional taxation measures. How crucial do you think is this particular measure in order to unlock that very IMF program? Dr. Vaqar, can you hear me, please?
Yes, Hassan, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I think unfortunately we have lost the connection with Dr. Vaqar Ahmed. We'll try to reconnect to him. In the meanwhile, Dr. Afzal, when we talk about this particular measure, as you have already mentioned one measure in this regard, that is the flood relief tax or the flood levy. So there are certain media reports that suggest that the authorities might also be considering imposing a levy of 60 to 70% tax on lofty bank profits. Your take regarding this?
Well, they're just not going to put a tax on bank profits. I think they are basically talking about the windfall that all these banks have been able to make because of, playing in the foreign exchange market, trying to make profit out of arbitrage. And I remember reading somewhere that the total profits that banks have made because of arbitrage in the foreign exchange market are upwards of rupees 100 billion. And so the taxation rate for corporations like banks is somewhere around 40 to 50%. And I think the government would be completely um, uh, within its right to tax
Justified
banks,
in
justified 40 to 50%, because this is extra windfall that these banks have made. Because remember, the purpose of all taxation in any economy or society is not to fund government functions or to fund defense. Rather, the function of taxation in any society or economy is redistribution, taking money away from those who have a lot of money and giving it to those who don't have it. And I think in doing so, the government would be completely justified.
right. Dr. Murtaza, do you think the government would be justified if it considered imposing a levy of 60 to 70% a tax on lofty bank profits, which they've allegedly earned through manipulation?
Yes, I think that would be a fair measure because a lot of these banks made money, and not only did they make money, they created a scare in the economy by withholding dollars, playing around with the rate, and that's caused a lot of damage to the economy. So I think it's very fair for the government to do that, and it's these kind of creative heads that the government should go for, which don't affect general inflation and which don't tax the poor directly. And that's not just an economy or equity consideration. It's also a political consideration because the government is up for elections in 8 to 10 months time, so they can't afford to do that. And that's the main reason we've been having all these delays in terms of signing up on the IMF deal. Because of the political consideration. But I think there is a way out of it where the government can protect its political consideration as well as take care of the economy, because if the IMF deal doesn't come through and there is a crash of the currency, then the political cost will be much higher, because the economy will then be in shambles. You see what happens in other countries which face hyperinflation, which face currency collapses, defaults, like we had in our neighborhood in Sri Lanka. It's extremely painful. The whole country was out of, petrol. The vehicles had come to a standstill. There was no medicine in the market. So it's in both their economic and political interest to, sign up on the IMF deal quickly.
So how do you think the government can strike a balance in fulfilling all those conditions, at the same time not burdening the masses to a certain extent where there could be a fallout of that on a general scale?
Well, that is the way to, just tax the rich. Of course, there is a political cost of it because, many of the rich are, their supporters and, their funders. In fact, many of our politicians are into business too, so it's not a cost-free, politically cost-free step. But then, if you look at the number of votes, then obviously it's not the same scale. So I think this is the best way out. The least costly measure for government is to, go after the elites, and, the elite nature of our economy is the real cause for, the crisis that we are facing today, because, it's so elite-focused and on short-term payoffs and profitability rather than real productivity. So it's time to dismantle this elite economics and go for something which benefits the masses.
Right. Dr. Afzal, your take regarding this, how the government authorities can strike a balance at the same time fulfilling the IMF conditions and also not burdening the masses?
Well, that's the $6 million question, how the government is going to be able to do it. Because on the one hand, there are these very strict conditionalities coming from the IMF in the shape of passing on increases in oil in the international market, letting your exchange rate be determined by market forces, so on and so forth. And all of these measures are going to bring about more and more and more inflation in Pakistan. On the other hand, the government is facing an environment whereby people are sick and tired of a very, very tough year that has just ended and of a very pernicious rate of inflation that doesn't seem to be coming down. So I think the government has work cut out for itself, and they are going to have to use all of their political, economic wisdom to, develop a middle path whereby the IMF program also comes back online, and people are not also burdened to an extent that there is widespread social and political unrest in Pakistan.
Right. Let's talk about another aspect of this, the circular debt. There is a demand by the IMF in order to increase those, redirect the subsidies as well as increasing the tariffs, including the power sector as well as the gas sector. Now, there is a consideration, according to some media reports, the government is considering the hike of 4.5 rupees per unit in the first phase when it comes to the power sector, and 3 rupees per unit in the second phase. So how crucial that one is in order to overcome the circular debt that happens to be around 1,640 billion rupees at the time? Dr. Afzal, please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I think the last I read somewhere, the total magnitude of the circular debt is upwards of 2.4, 2.5 trillion rupees. So I think this figure of 640 billion, I don't know where this figure is coming from. But as far as these price increases are concerned, I think if the government, there are two things that are going to happen. The first thing with the price increase, what we can see is that the government is serious about attacking this huge amount of circular debt that has now posing a very realistic danger to the fact that it can actually choke Pakistan's power sector. So that's the first thing. And the second thing the government, I think, is trying to do with these price increases is they're trying to slow down more increases in the circular debt, so that once the rate of increase has slowed down, whatever is left behind in terms of stock can then be attacked in order to reduce it. So I think I see this as evidence of this government's seriousness in trying to address this really huge problem of circular debt in the power sector.
Right. Dr. Murtaza, your take regarding reducing the circular debt, what measures the government should be taking in this regard?
Of course, it is a huge problem. It just keeps on increasing. It used to be 500 billion, then touch 1 trillion, and it's just endless. And obviously, we cannot let it, pile up like this. The only thing is that, with the current situation, with the current slowdown, if you jack up, electricity prices, obviously that increases the cost of living as well as the cost of production. Which is unfortunate. So, what the government should do is to, make sure that they protect the lower slabs, which are, of course, consumed by, the poor people, and make sure that, the focus is more on the rich people again. But definitely, this circular debt issue has been piling on for years, and it's time, we reduce it. And, we have to attack, the root causes of it. It's not enough to, dish out money, because we've done that before, and then it slows down for a while, and then it keeps increasing because the root causes are not fixed, which is the line losses, which is the stealing of electricity, which is the use of very expensive type of fuel which has very high cost, imported fuel, which is very expensive rather than, using indigenous sources. So we need to, move to more hydro. We need to more indigenous sources and, cut down on, the use of imported fuel. So these are some of the steps that the government should take.
Right, Dr. Aqdas, Afzal, when we talk about the World Bank, it says that macroeconomic stability in Pakistan can be achieved if the power sector is fixed. There are certain recommendations by it also, so which include what ideally these should be. What do you think those could be in order to overcome this circular debt?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to be done is that, like Dr. Niaz Murtaza pointed out, that we have to make sure that Pakistan's power sector can reduce line losses and theft of electricity. Now, one way in which electricity theft can be reduced, this can be addressed by introducing smart meters in Pakistan. So when I say smart meters, I'm basically referring to my trip to Japan that took place 12 years ago, and I witnessed in Japan a mechanism whereby people purchase what would look like cards that we purchase here in Pakistan to upload balance in a mobile, and you scratch it and you swipe it in a electricity meter, and that electricity meter then runs for exactly the amount of money that has been uploaded. So I think that's definitely one way in which Pakistan can address electricity theft, because if we do not address electricity theft, these losses, I'm afraid we are not going to be able to stop and reduce this huge amount of circular debt that now is posing a very realistic danger to Pakistan's power sector.
Right, Dr. Murtaza, now when it comes to overcoming these line losses and the electricity theft, is it included in reducing the generation cost? Because of, do you think because of these two things, the overall generation cost is also increased?
Well, no, I mean, generation cost is separate from, line losses. Line losses happens at the distribution end of thing. So there are problems in the distribution side of thing as well as the generation side of thing. The problem at the distribution side is line losses, electricity theft, and so on. The issue at the generation side of it is that, we are using very expensive kind of fuel to generate electricity, imported oil, whose prices keeps going up and which, puts a very heavy burden on our current account deficit as well, especially when oil prices are higher. So the both issues are, different, but, they of course, come together to increase, the circular debt that we have.
Right. Dr. Niaz Murtaza, political economist, joining us on the phone line. Thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News. And now, Dr. Aqdas, Afzal, so there are certain recommendations now by the World Bank, reducing the generation cost, decarbonizing energy mix, improving distribution efficiency, which you have already mentioned, to overcome the electricity theft and the line losses, and also retargeting electricity subsidies. Let's talk about the first one, reducing the generation cost. What sort of measures in particular can be taken in this regard?
The first thing that needs to be addressed when it comes to generation cost is to have a look, to reevaluate, review Pakistan's energy mix. Right now, Pakistan's energy mix is excessively dependent on imported fuel, which, the price of which fluctuates. Sometimes it goes upwards of $110, $120 a barrel. And because of that imported fuel, Pakistan's overall generation cost keeps going up. So I think what needs to be done is to focus on hydel sources of energy, number one. Pakistan must get its act together and construct the hydroelectric dams that we have been talking about for some time. And we must move towards bringing more and more
solarization?
Sorry?
What about solarization? Bringing
exactly.
in the renewable energy as well.
The point that I was trying to make is that we must move towards more and more alternate sources of energy and, bring them into the national grid. And obviously, one way in which this can be done is through solarization. Now, many efforts have been done. A lot of people are switching over to solar panels. There is a plan at the level of the government to convert government buildings to solar energy. We must also move towards wind energy. And finally, we must also contemplate using nuclear energy for electricity generation. I think that is something that has remained somewhat underdeveloped in Pakistan, especially when Pakistan already has nuclear energy for defense purposes. So I think we already have that technology, and a lot of countries in the world, especially France and some other European countries in the world, who are now facing very high prices for imported gas, are now switching back to nuclear energy. And I think that's something that Pakistan also needs to focus on in the medium term in order to reduce generation cost for our economy.
Right. We are joined once again by Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, a Joint Executive Director, Sustainable Development Policy Institute. Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We are talking about the conditions being set by the IMF in order to unlock that very program with Pakistan. So how crucial is it for Pakistani authorities in order to meet those demands and strike that balance of not burdening the masses at the same time?
Yes, thank you very much. I believe that the authorities know very well and already knew of these demands since long. And I think the authorities had actually, within the same demand framework, they had actually agreed to walk this path, which is what secured the 7th and 8th review of the IMF program. Now I believe that the question only is whether the government has the will to walk that path. We do understand that this could be an election year. We do understand that tough decisions could cost them votes, but sanity should prevail, and what is in the interest of country has already been committed by Pakistan with the fund program. It's just that we have to walk the line. It's not something which IMF had demanded, which was a one-sided ask. Of course, both sides had collectively sat down and signed the program.
But Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, the authorities in Pakistan have repeatedly said that they are determined to complete the IMF program. But in the aftermath of the devastating floods, don't you think there should be a sort of a flexibility by the IMF and the other lenders to give sort of a room to Pakistani authorities so that the economy of the country could be stabilized?
Yeah, that's true. That's true, and this can happen in one or two ways. One is that the Pakistani side has to convince the fund and the donors with regards to the loss and damage, what are the actual numbers, so to say, with regards to, for example, rehabilitation and reconstruction. We do understand that some numbers have already been presented to the donors, but IMF felt that most of the loss and damage which has been there, that is being compensated through a different channel, which of course Pakistan has received decent pledges at Geneva as well. But the demand with regards to structural reforms is not something that should not go through, given that there is a flood-related crisis. For example, if there are changes to be done in the tax code, for example, if there are governance improvements which are required on the energy side, if something has to be done on the privatization side, this probably has nothing to do with the floods per se. At least these things should be expedited.
Right. When we talk about bringing in the additional tax measures, what sort of measures do you suggest the government should bring in?
Yes, I think there is room for two or three things. One is that indirect taxes, as you have rightly said, that this is a flood-hit population. Indirect taxes should see a reduction, but compensatory revenue measures should come in the form of higher direct taxes, at least on those who can bear it. That's one. Second, of course, there is a significant tax gap. We still need to go after those sectors who are not paying their tax as per the law. And then third, of course, the tax avoidance part also has to be addressed. And this is an administrative issue. Already FBR has quite an extensive data on individuals and corporate entities who may be involved in tax avoidance. It's just that political will which is required to go after them now.
So how to overcome the circular debt? What measures do you suggest in that regard?
Yes, I think two or three immediate things can be done. Of course, while there are longer-term solutions like changing the energy mix, they are very good. They should be pursued. But in the short term, one is to improve the receivables of our energy companies. They should be able to recover the full economic cost, which also means that if the government owes some money to these energy companies, that should also be expedited. Second, of course, is that any sort of cross subsidies or hidden subsidies which are in the system, they should be removed. Subsidy should only be for the lifeline consumer of energy. Currently, there are subsidies in the system which go to industry, which go to individuals even who can actually afford power and gas on the market determined rate. And third, I believe there is room to cut down the technical losses. There's room to cut down theft in the system, for example. So with these three very concrete measures...
So how to cut that, the third thing that you have just mentioned, how to cut that one down? What measures?
Yes, I think for this, of course, already the ministry had a plan, a decent plan, to work in collaboration with the provinces. You need commitment of provincial governments to go after those who are involved in this. For example, if somebody, if HESCO or KESCO or in Multan, for example, if there are instances where, for example, you know that there's theft taking place, it's not the federal ministry that can go after them. It's not the regulator that can go after them. You need to have an MOU with that provincial government, with that province, to go after theft.
Right, Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, please stay with us. Dr. Aqdas, Afzal, when we talk about the current state of economy, of course, the recent devastating floods had a huge impact. But before that, the current government accuses the previous government of its wrong decisions and the policies. And when particularly we talk about the IMF program, there's been an interview of the planning minister Hassan Iqbali has categorically said that Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf ruined the IMF program. So not meeting the conditions at that time, how detrimental that particular policy of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf government was that at that time, and was that detrimental in creating a more trust deficit between the Pakistani authorities and the IMF?
Well, I think when the previous administration decided not to pass on the increases in international oil prices to the final consumer, I think they had their own reasons. But when they did that, they did actually create some difficulty for the next administration that was sworn in April. And because of that gap, that fiscal gap that was left behind, the previous finance minister had to work very hard in trying to convince the IMF to bring back that program back online. Because you might remember that because prices were not being, the increase in prices was not being passed on to the final consumer, the IMF put the program on, how should I say, on freeze, basically. I mean, they froze that program. And so when the new administration came in, they had to work very hard to convince the IMF to bring that back online. So yes, I think the previous administration had its reasons to not pass on the price increases to the final consumer,
right.
But doing that did actually create problems for the present administration.
Right. Let me take Dr. Vaqar Ahmed's view on this particular thing. Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, please go ahead. Dr. Vaqar, can you hear me, please?
Yes, now I can hear you. Yes.
Okay,
Could you repeat the question, please?
Detrimental was it on the part of Pakistan and Tehreek-e-Insaf government, as said by Planning Minister Hassan that it ruined the IMF program? So do you think it was the basic reason that created the trust deficit between the Pakistani authorities and the IMF?
Well, I believe that after the budget last year, the government, PTI government, did take a different stand on the IMF program. Somehow there was a realization that economy had improved. That realization proved to be a little premature, and the government also felt that they could move into expansionary fiscal policy where growth could be promoted, and that's how they designed the budget, which of course didn't go too well with the IMF, because IMF felt that this was not something which was committed in the sixth review. The sixth review had in fact hinted at a much more conservative budget than was presented in June. So certainly amongst several factors, that budget by the government did derail the process.
Right. Dr. Aqdas, Afzal, there is another development. The 8th meeting of the Pakistani-Russian Intergovernmental Commission on Trade, Economic, Scientific and Technical Cooperation has started. Now, the Russian energy minister has also said that our goal is to develop cooperative business relations with Pakistan, and we have discussed cooperation in energy, industry, agriculture, customs, education and IT. How crucial is this cooperation between Pakistan and Russia, and what sort of a respite it could give to Pakistan's overall economic outlook?
Well, whatever is going on with respect to the hostilities between Russia and Ukraine, those notwithstanding, I think Russia is a very large and a very important economy in the world. They're one of the biggest producers of both oil and gas, as well as supply weapons, science and technology to a lot of the countries in the world. So I think Pakistan should have a very close working relationship with Russia, and that so I welcome this development, especially because I've been reading about this, that if the negotiations between Pakistan and Russia are successful, Pakistan would be able to save upwards of $2 billion per year, and that would go a very long way in creating more financing space for Pakistan. So I think it's a very welcome development. I really hope that Pakistan and Russia are able to ink some, not only some MOUs, that they're able to actually implement those agreements in such a way that it results in some massive foreign exchange savings that we've been hearing about. So I welcome it, and I'm excited that this can go through.
Right. Dr. Vaqar, your take regarding this cooperation between Pakistan and Russia, how fruitful and how bigger a respite it can be for Pakistan's economy?
Yes, I believe it's a very welcome development, as Dr. Aqdas has already highlighted, But I was hoping that both sides would open up for a much more broad-based agenda. Currently, of course, I do see that the larger focus is on the energy supplies, a bit on food supplies as well. There's some cooperation over there. Some cooperation around infrastructure building, financing side of infrastructure as well. But I was actually hoping for a much more broad-based agenda where trade relations between the two countries, when it comes to trade in goods, trade in services, those could be strengthened. I do understand that Russia has free trade agreements and preferential trade arrangements with Central Asian republics. That is something which, of course, Pakistan should also be eyeing, so that its merchandise can get custom-free access in Russian markets.
Right. Dr. Vaqar, I'm a Joint Executive Director, Sustainable Development Policy Institute. Thank you very much for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate your time. And on Skype, we were joined by Dr. Aqdas Afzal, Senior Economist. Dr. Afzal, thank you very much for your time, also for being on Views on News tonight. And with this, we come to the end of today's show. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.